Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we explored the foundation of classical economics and saw that even at the early stage, there were important concerns about limits, particularly related to population and natural resources, land. In today's lecture, we take that discussion forward by examining the transition from classical economics to neoclassical economics. So as we go through this lecture, you will notice that how the idea of resource constraints and ecological limits gradually fades from mainstream economic thinking. And I'm saying mainstream because even today, to a large extent, we still continue to believe in the neoclassical school of thought. So understanding this transition is very, very important because it also helps us see why ecological economics later emerges as a response, essentially to bring back the question of limits into economic analysis, which was discussed during classical times but was not mentioned at all in neoclassical theory. Okay, but before we move forward, let us briefly recap what we discussed in the previous lecture on classical economics very briefly. So classical economics largely viewed the economy as something separate from nature, although it did talk about limits to growth, but still, despite that, it did not look at nature as a resource or did not use the term nature. It basically mentioned labor or in the sense population growth and land. So this perspective also actually, and then we also spoke about industrial revolution. All of these basically brought a strong belief that economic growth could continue indefinitely, largely driven by technological progress, despite the fact that classical economists did talk about that there is a relationship between constraint which will be brought by population and land. Now, importantly, however, although they were not unaware of these limits, as I had mentioned by both Malthus and Ricardo spoke about it, but despite these early insights, classical economics ultimately struggled to explain the major real world crisis, and which is why we see that classical economics ultimately, failed to respond to many of the world crisis like the Great Depression, and one of the problem was that it relied on somewhat very simplistic assumptions, and as a result, it gradually lost prominence and gave way to new approaches, particularly the neoclassical economics. However, one important point because in 1971 onwards, classical economics kind of started to lose its prominence, it doesn't mean that classical economics' contribution to economics is in any way less. They made tremendous contribution. They actually came up with a more structured way of thinking, came from the classical school of thought. And you will see when we talk about ecological economics actually brings back a lot of discussion, particularly the concept of steady state that Ricardo spoke about in the ecological economics school of thought as well. Okay, now before moving to the neoclassical economics, I want to very quickly bring out one of the classical economists which we did not spoke about in the last class was John Stuart Mill. Now, why did I keep John Stuart Mill, or in short Mill, outside the classical economist discussion? Because Mill's understanding or perspective on economic growth was very different, even different than what you saw in terms of Adam Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo. Mill was mostly known to be not just an economist, but also a philosopher. So unlike many of his contemporaries, Mill did not view the idea of a steady state economy as something negative or undesirable. He instead argued, it's very interesting, that economy would eventually, or economy needs to eventually reach a state of steady state, because that is the state where both population and output will also stabilize. And this steady state should be looked as a potentially positive development. So what makes Mill particularly interesting in his shift in focus, like from continuous economic growth to human well-being? This is the shift in focus that Mill brought in, that from continuous economic growth, we are now also talking about human well-being. He believed that beyond a certain point, more growth does not necessarily translate into better quality of life. And if you really look at today's world, so much growth, we always talk about double digit, etc. But if you also compare that amount of growth with quality of life, it hasn't really improved much, although there is a lot of growth. So instead, a steady state could allow for greater leisure, social progress, and improved living conditions. This is what Mill spoke about. It's a time when you reach that level, you don't necessarily have to continuously grow. You can now talk about human well-being, social progress, and how can you improve living conditions. So he also showed an early awareness of resource limits, expressing concern about overuse of natural resources and need to preserve nature. He did mention about this as well. And another important aspect of his thinking was the emphasis on distribution and equity, something which has come back again, and we all talk about now: justice, fairness, equity. Imagine Mill in the 18th century himself, he spoke about distribution and equity. Mill argued that once growth stabilizes, the focus should shift towards how all of that wealth we have generated, how can we distribute it within society, rather than simply increasing, more and more outputs. And again, if you look at many of the developed countries where probably the growth rate is not even 2%, but that doesn't mean that because they are not growing at a double digit, they are starving. But this is exactly what Mill was talking about. In this sense, Mill actually offers one of the earliest and most insightful vision of what we might today call as a sustainable and socially desirable, economy. Okay, now the thought was very good, the idea, but did not come at a very right time. So why was Mill also ignored like the way Malthus and Ricardo was? So despite the depth and the foresight in Mill's ideas, they did not really gain much traction at that time. One of the key reasons for this was the changing economic and technological context. Like if you remember, I spoke to you, I also explained that this was also the time when industrial revolution set in. And in fact, it was now moving more towards the second phase. So the discovery, particularly increasing use of oil as a major energy source, significantly weakened all the earlier concerns actually about resource constraints. It created a sense that natural limits could be overcome through substitution and innovation. At the same time, there was growing confidence in technology and market mechanisms. So economists and policymakers increasingly believed that any emerging scarcity could be addressed either through technological progress and efficient market adjustments. So this led to a dominant belief again that economic growth could continue indefinitely without any binding constraints. So in this context, Mill's concern about limits and sustainability were largely overlooked. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, as you can see what he was talking about, anticipating resource scarcity, even when resources appeared abundant at the time. And there was no immediate signs of shortage. But this shift in thinking away from limits and towards optimism about growth, it sets the stage for the emergence of neoclassical economics, which is what we will now turn to. So let's now come. So this was where the last classical economist era ended after what Mill spoke about. And then, it gave birth to a new school of thought moving from classical economics to neoclassical school of thought or neoclassical economics. It's a major turning point actually in the history of economic thought. We also call it as the marginal revolution of the 1870s, which marks the birth of neoclassical economics. So what exactly happened during this time? This period saw a fundamental shift in how economists understood value and economic behavior. Earlier, like classical economists had mostly focused on the labor theory of value. They had a lot of emphasis on land and labor, where value was largely linked to cost of production. If you remember, when Ricardo mentioned that there will be a stagnation or steady state, that was because cost of production will go up, like overall cost of production will go up. However, with marginal revolution, the focus actually shifted to marginal utility. Now, what is this marginal utility? This is the value individuals place on an additional unit of a good or service. I'm going to explain this a bit more in the later slide, but let's just try and understand that it's basically talking about the last unit, the marginal unit. What is the value of the last unit of goods or services that is being produced? What exactly is the value of that particular good? Along with this, there was a broader shift in perspective from looking at the economy in terms of production and resource constraints. It moved to focusing on individual choice, preferences, and optimization. So this is a very important shift. So far, when you listen to classical economics, they don't talk about an individual firm or an individual, except when Smith spoke about each one of us will think from our own interests, and so it will lead to market efficiency. But there too, they do not talk about individually how one would act. They say that because individually everybody would work in a correct way as rational people, that would ultimately bring the economy into a right state, right? Equilibrium state. But here in neoclassical economics, we kind of move from macroeconomics, that is larger economy, to individual choice, preferences, and optimization, which we usually call it as a microeconomics, right? So as a result, the emphasis of economics moved increasingly towards micro level, where behavior of individual consumers and firms became central to every analysis. The key takeaway from this transition is that economics began to move away from understanding limits and constraint and instead focused more on how individuals make choices under given conditions. And in simple terms, we can say that economics shifted from a concern with limits to a focus on choices, what kind of choices are available, and optimization. Now, who are the key thinkers and what exactly is marginal analysis? That is also important to understand. So, as I mentioned, building on the marginal revolution, let us now look at some of the key thinkers who shaped the neoclassical economics. And they are mainly, William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, Karl Menger. Although they worked independently in different countries, they all arrived at a similar idea around marginal utility and individual decision making. Now, as I mentioned, a central concept that emerges from their work is marginal analysis, which becomes the core analytical tool in economics. Even today, we teach marginal analysis, in the sense marginal cost and revenue, to our student, and it continues to be a very important way of deciding how much a firm should produce. So to understand this, let us look at two key ideas. One is marginal cost and another is marginal revenue. So what is marginal cost? Marginal cost refers to the additional cost of producing one more unit of a good. Meaning, if I am producing, say, glasses, what is the cost of producing the 10th glass? So if my total cost of producing 10 glasses is, suppose, 100 rupees, just to give you an example. So my question, if I ask you, what is the marginal cost of producing the 10th glass, then you would say that the 10th glass is produced with 10 rupees. Because when you add up each glass, you're basically talking about total cost. When you look at each last unit glass, what is the cost? Then it is 10 rupees, right? Similarly, while marginal revenue, you mean to say, what is the additional revenue did I earn by selling not all the glasses, but the last glass, 10. So when I go to the market, I have 10 glasses in my hand, and then I am selling each one of them maybe in different prices. Then I ask you, what is the marginal revenue? What is the price that you get, or what is the revenue you receive by selling the last glass? And you may say, oh, I got 11 rupees, or maybe I just got 10 rupees, right? So this is called the last unit. So remember, when you say marginal, it is either last unit cost of production for that last unit, or revenue you got or you earned by selling that one more unit or one last unit. Okay, so again, you can either say, as I'm telling you, as last, but usually, to make it simple, but usually it is the additional unit. So marginal is always one, then another, whereas total is taking all of these together. Now, firms make decisions based on the relationship between these two. So if marginal revenue, that means the revenue that you earn by selling the additional unit that you produce. So you have been producing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you produce the sixth unit and you are selling them in the market. The revenue that you get by selling the additional unit at the sixth units, let's say, is greater than the cost that you had incurred in producing that sixth unit. So suppose the sixth glass that you have produced today, the cost of production was 10 rupees. That's only six glass. So do keep in mind, I'm not talking about total cost, only the six glass. And then you take that glass to the market and the money that you get is suppose 12 rupees. So you make a profit of 2 extra rupees. So which means that for producing the last or the additional unit that is six glass is 10 rupees, marginal cost is 10 rupees, and marginal revenue is 12 rupees. So this is the case where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. The one which I'm showing here on the slide, MC is less than MR. So MC is 10, MR is 12. So this means that you can further expand your production. But suppose then next day when you take your seventh unit, your cost of production is suppose 10 rupees and you fetched also 10 rupees, right? So it's a no profit, no loss situation. So you spent 10 rupees, you received also 10 rupees as revenue. This is the case of MC is equal to MR. Now, this is the point where a rational firm would stop its production, which means that where the amount of demand that is there, that you can only sell up to that unit. If you produce more, then what would happen is that you can produce the same, say around another seventh glass or eighth glass at 10 rupees. But when you take that to the market to be sold, it's too many in the market, the price may fall, and due to which you may fetch only say 9 rupees or 8 rupees. So you are at a loss. Your cost of producing that eighth glass is higher than the revenue that you got from the market. So this is where we say MC is greater than MR. This means that you need to reduce production. So this concept, actually, why is it important? Because it tells a firm where the stop rule, where does it need to stop producing, right? So what is important here is that the kind of marginal reasoning I'm talking about becomes central, not just for firms, but also for economic thinking broadly. So there are so many firms across the world. All the firm would basically only look at where their MC becomes equal to MR. And wherever they reach that, this is where they will say, okay, this is the stop rule. We should stop producing further. So we can say that with the rise of neoclassical economics, marginal analysis became actually a primary tool for understanding economic behavior, how firm behaves, and also decision making, right? Okay. Now, let us look at how neoclassical economists' view of economic view actually, how do they actually look at the economy as a whole? So far, we spoke about not just the economy, but as a firm, right? So at the core of the framework, there is a very strong assumption. First of all, that the economy can grow indefinitely. That continued to be the mantra of neoclassical economics. Growth is not seen as something that would ever face a hard limit, but rather there might be some disruption in between, but it will always be continuous and it's a desirable process. Underlying this again is an important idea that economy is treated as if it is not constrained by nature at all. In other words, natural systems are not seen as imposing binding limits on the economic expansion. These are some of the way of looking at the economy. Now, this leads to, of course, several critical assumptions. First, it is assumed that economic growth does not significantly displace or degrade ecosystems, as if we are growing in void. So when you have more roads, when you have more, urbanization, when you have more bridges, neoclassical economists assumed that as if we are not displacing anything, as if there are already so many void spaces that you can just keep growing. That was the first assumption. Second, the expansion of the economy is seen as if it has no real cost. I mean, only thing that you are getting is benefit by expanding. There is no cost associated with that expansion, particularly from the environmental impact perspective. And more broadly, the economy is implicitly treated as if it is the entire system, rather than a subsystem embedded within a larger ecological system. It's exactly the same thing which I brought out on the first day in the first lecture, that ecosystem is considered to be a very, very small system within a larger system. The entire system is actually economy. And therefore, when it is entire system is economy and there is no environment that one can see, so we feel that we are actually expanding in a situation of void. There is nothing that we are encroaching. As a result, actually, there is no opportunity cost of growing. There is no cost of growing at all. Now, what this means is that costs associated with using up natural resources or encroaching on ecological space are largely either ignored or completely left out of the analysis. So in effect, this way of thinking remove the idea of the limits entirely from economic analysis, something which even classical economists spoke about. And eventually this itself becomes a central point of critique in ecological economics. Okay. Now let's try and understand the short-run focus and optimal scale problem. One of the most interesting thing is that an important feature of neoclassical economics is that it has a very strong focus on short run. Now, when I'm saying short run, it basically means that about say next 10 years. And if you really look at it, most of our economic planning are also done for 5 years. Right. So we have 5-year plan. So this is exactly what neoclassical economics talks about. It basically says, and this is a well-known Keynesian, Keynes was one of the neoclassical economists, and Keynes once mentioned that why should we think about long run? Because in the long run, we are all dead. So we need to only talk about now, when we are all alive. How can we make most of this time? At that time, this made sense because we had enough resources. But today, when we are talking about climate change, when we are talking about projections, why are we doing all that? Because it seems that all that we have been doing in the short run will have a huge impact in the long run. And already we are seeing that, because at that time, when they all thought about short run and not of the long run, which is why today we also have to, mend our way of production, etc., due to all the CO2 emission that we see. Now, what this reflect is a concern with, immediate economic question is that how to allocate given resources efficiently in order to maximize outputs and benefit. And the central focus is on making the best possible use of available resources at a given point of time, because resources are limited and there are alternative uses. How do you then decide where you need to provide, invest in which resource? So at the micro economic level, this is quite clear and well defined, because as we mentioned, as I had already explained to you, that they mostly, all the farms would produce up to the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So at farm level, everybody knows that, okay, this is the stop rule and this is where we have to stop. And this also gives us a very clear idea of what the optimal level of production should be. However, when we move to the macroeconomic level, things becomes less clear, right? There is no equivalent rule that tells us what is the optimal scale of the economy as a whole. In other words, there is no clear answer to how large the economy should grow relative to the environment. Like there are so many farms, take the example of India, every farm at the micro level, at their own individual level, they might be doing perfectly fine by producing at MC equal to MR. But that they are also, functioning in within a larger finite world, and how many farms can come in and how many farms can be at MC equal to MR situation, that optimal scale of the economy is not clear, and we don't get that response or answer from neoclassical economics. As a result, the implicit assumption becomes that economy should simply continue to grow without any defined limit, as long as you or everybody is at MC equal to MR. So while neoclassical economics provides a clear framework for decision making at, like at micro level, it lacks a corresponding framework, unfortunately, at the macro level. And in that sense, we can say that at the macro level, there is no real concept of how much is too much, which becomes a critical issue as well today in today's world. Here, I want to bring in our important concept, because this concept will become very important eventually as well, and that is called the opportunity cost of growth. So, it's very important in the sense that it also helps us in understanding ecological implications of economic growth. Now, I mentioned this that for neoclassical economists, that there is no opportunity cost of growing. So it means that opportunity cost basically refers to the value of the next best alternative that we give up when we make a choice, because every decision involves a trade-off. So you have a wetland, you can either keep the wetland the way it is, or you can completely, fill up the wetland and you can make a road on it. So when you decide to go for making a road, what is the opportunity cost? The opportunity cost of is all the functions that the wetland was providing. It's gone because it's no longer exists, right? So that is the meaning of opportunity cost, because every decision involves a trade-off. Even if it is not immediately visible, there is a trade-off. So today you see that most of the urban cities, urban centers have degraded their wetland. And one of the major costs of that degradation is that we see a lot of urban floods. It's all concretized. There is no place where the water can flow in. So that's the opportunity cost of having a kind of urbanization which actually takes away all the natural resources that the city earlier had. Hyderabad, for example, is a classic case. So what we are basically telling here is that um, you are you are not expanding, or you are not actually uh, in a place which is void. Like I said, neoclassical economics assumes that they are growing in a situation which there's nothing that they're encroaching. We are expanding not in isolation. We are actually expanding within a finite ecological space. So this means that as the economy grows, it inevitably encroaches on natural systems. Forests may be cleaned, wetlands may be drained, ecosystems may be altered to make way for economic activities. So the key point here is that expanding the economy often involves sacrificing ecosystems and the natural functions they provide, such as clean air, water regulation, biodiversity, and climate stability. And these costs are not always captured in traditional economic analysis, which also includes neoclassical economics, which tends to focus only on things which are possible to have a transaction in the market. So you can't really sell clean air, you cannot really sell biodiversity, you cannot really sell climate stability, because there is no market value for those functions that natural system plays. So they never come under an economic analysis. But if you ask me from an ecological economics perspective, it is important to recognize that growth is not free. It comes with a hidden ecological cost, and these costs can have long-term consequences for both environment and human well-being. So in a nutshell, important to remember that every time we grow, there is an opportunity cost associated with this growth. Now, another interesting thing about neoclassical economics, it believed in something called two-sector model. And what is this two-sector model? Let us look at one of the most fundamental representations used in the neoclassical economics, the circular flow model, which is what we call, which describes the economy as an interaction between household and firms. So first of all, why two sector? Meaning there are only two sectors. One is household and another is farms. And in this model, what you see on the slide itself, the household, what is the role of household? Household supply labor. One hand, they supply labor, and on the other hand, they also receive wages. So that's why you see two arrows coming from the diagram. One is showing that, labor, which is also a factor of production, it provides its labor and it goes to the firm. And then the firm, because as a household, as a labor, I'm providing services to the firm, I'm also getting wages, rents or dividends from the firm. Then the labor themselves, and what is the firm doing? Firm is giving you goods and services. So whatever is produced is again going back to the same labor who is also providing their services. Now, if you really ask me, overall, in a way, it is true. Maybe here the idea is only about firm, but everybody who is working and in the labor market are labor. Like even I'm a labor, and whatever is produced in the firm, I'm also going and buying that. Even the firm people themselves would buy them. right? So there is a circular flow. So that is where households expenditure again goes back to the firm. Let me repeat this. What I'm saying is that household acts as a factor of production, as labor. They go to the firm to produce goods and services, and those goods and services are also mostly consumed by the households. And in return, the firms gives them wages, and these wages also helps them to actually buy these goods and services. It also provides them with rent. If suppose I'm a landowner, my factor of production suppose is land, then I will get rent from the firm. It can also be in the form of dividends. Similarly, what the firms get in return when consumers are buying goods and services, the expenditure becomes a source of income for the firms. So what is interesting here is that what you see most interesting here is that it's something where one thing is strikingly missing, and that is nature. So it only talks about the entire exchange happens only between two sectors. Natural resources, ecosystems, environmental process are explicitly, are not explicitly included in this framework. So if one looks at it, automatically you will feel that natural resources are there, they are needed, but they are not so important. What is important is only the firm and the household. And this is a diagram which even I studied as an economist, and we grew up studying these two sector model. As a result, this model does not really account that economic activities also depend on natural inputs, nor does it capture the impact of economic processes on the environment. And so this leads to a major consequence. So there is little or no concern of resource depletion or environmental degradation within the standard economic framework. So economics would not talk about resource depletion or environmentalism until the time environmental economics came in. But up till neoclassical economics, we never spoke about these things. And in that sense, this omission represents one of the most important limitations also of the neoclassical economics, now particularly when we begin to think about sustainability, right? Okay, so to conclude, what we have seen in this lecture is a clear shift in economic thinking from an earlier concern with limits, which classical economists particularly brought in, to a much stronger focus on efficiency, optimization, and continuous growth in the neoclassical framework. And in this transition, the role of nature becomes increasingly marginal, and eventually it almost disappears from economic analysis altogether, like I showed you in the two sector model. And this creates a significant gap because the economy is in reality embedded within the environment and cannot function independently. So I'm going to stop here for this lecture. When we meet again in the next lecture, I'm going to bring out a bit on environmental economics, because there is always a confusion that ecological economics and environmental economics are similar, but actually they are not. So it is important before we go to ecological economics, we will bring in environmental economics, and we'll ask again the same question, whether environmental economics understood the limit and that economic growth really cannot be limitless in a finite world. Thank you.